Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Did you borrow that dress from a museum? My daughter-in-law Vanessa asked loudly enough for half the room to hear, and the laughter that followed rolled across the ballroom like a cold draft. I simply smiled and adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress. At 69 years old, I had learned that some people reveal far more about themselves than they ever reveal about you. The engagement party for my granddaughter Sophie was being held at a beautiful country club outside Hartford, Connecticut. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead, soft music drifted through the room, and servers moved between guests carrying trays of sparkling cider and appetizers. It should have been a perfect evening. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready that afternoon. I carefully pinned my silver hair into place, applied a touch of lipstick, and chose the same dress hanging quietly in the back of my closet for decades. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't trendy. But it mattered to me. The moment I walked into the ballroom, I noticed Vanessa's eyes sweep over me. She wore a designer gown she had mentioned at least 4 times during the previous week. Her smile appeared pleasant at first, but I recognized the expression behind it. I had seen it growing stronger every year since she married my son Ryan. "Evelyn," she said as she approached, glancing at my dress again. I didn't realize vintage meant this vintage. A few guests chuckled. Someone awkwardly looked away. Another pretended not to hear. I felt Sophie's eyes find mine from across the room, concern flickering across her face. I gave her a small reassuring nod. Tonight was about her, not me. Vanessa laughed lightly and turned toward a group of friends. "I suppose fashion always comes back eventually," she said. More laughter followed. Ryan stood nearby holding a drink. He shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. That silence hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. I moved toward a quieter corner of the room and accepted a glass of water from a passing server. Through the large windows, the last colors of the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. For a moment, I focused on that view instead of the conversations behind me. People often assume that age makes insults easier to ignore. The truth is that it simply teaches you which ones deserve your attention. This one didn't. Least not yet. As the evening continued, I noticed several guests glancing toward me and then toward my dress. Vanessa had turned it into a topic of discussion. I overheard phrases like old-fashioned and outdated. One woman even asked if it was a costume. I smiled politely each time and answered very little. The dress carried memories that no one in that ballroom understood. It had witnessed chapters of my life that were worth more than anyone's opinion. Then, just as I was considering stepping outside for a breath of fresh air, an elegant older woman across the room froze mid-conversation and stared directly at me. Her eyes narrowed, not with judgment but with recognition. She carefully set down her glass and began walking toward me. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, I had the feeling that everything was about to change. The woman approaching me moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed without asking for attention. She appeared to be in her early 70s, elegantly dressed, her silver hair styled neatly, her posture perfectly straight. When she stopped in front of me, she did not introduce herself immediately. Instead, she looked carefully at the dress, studying the fabric, the stitching, and the delicate details near the collar. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Around us, conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and laughter drifted across the ballroom. Then she smiled. "I never thought I would see one of these in person again," she said. Her words caught me by surprise. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside us. "Oh, you noticed the dress too?" she said with a laugh. "It has certainly become a conversation piece tonight." The woman turned toward her politely. "Indeed it has." Something in her tone made Vanessa straighten slightly. "I am Margaret Hayes," the woman continued, extending her hand toward me. "I spent more than 40 years working with historical fashion collections and private archives." I shook her hand and introduced myself. Margaret looked back at the dress. "May I ask where you got this?" For a moment, the ballroom faded away. My eyes settled on the familiar sleeve resting against my arm. "My husband gave it to me many years ago," I said. "I have kept it ever since." Margaret nodded slowly. That explains why it has survived in such remarkable condition. Vanessa forced a smile. I am sure it is sentimental. Margaret glanced toward her. Sentimental, yes. But that is not what caught my attention. A few nearby guests had begun listening. The small circle around us grew larger without anyone seeming to notice. Ryan stepped closer. Sophie appeared beside him. Even the music seemed quieter. Margaret carefully pointed toward a subtle detail in the fabric near the shoulder. Do you see this stitching pattern? She asked. I nodded. Very few people recognize it today. It was used by a celebrated American designer during a brief period in the late 1970s. Most pieces from that collection disappeared into private ownership decades ago. Vanessa's expression shifted slightly. The confidence she had carried all evening seemed less certain now. Margaret continued examining the dress with genuine admiration. Collectors spend years searching for garments from that line. Museums have displayed examples. Private buyers compete for them whenever one appears. I looked down at the dress, suddenly seeing it through different eyes. To me, it had always been connected to memories. To others, it seemed to represent something much larger. Around us, whispers spread quietly through the room. People who had ignored me earlier were now paying close attention. Vanessa folded her arms and laughed softly, but the sound lacked conviction. Well, she said, that is certainly interesting. Margaret smiled. Interesting is not the word I would use. She paused, her eyes still fixed on the dress. Extraordinary would be much closer. For several seconds nobody spoke. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had shifted so completely that it felt like a different event from the one I had walked into earlier that evening. The same guests who had barely acknowledged me when I arrived were now looking at my dress with curiosity instead of amusement. Margaret remained calm, but there was a quiet certainty in her voice that commanded attention. The craftsmanship alone is remarkable, she said. Most people today never have the opportunity to see work like this up close. Vanessa glanced around and forced another smile. I had no idea a dress could attract this much attention. Margaret nodded politely. Most people would not. Fashion history is often overlooked until something rare appears. Ryan stepped closer to me. It was the first time all evening that he had seemed genuinely interested in the conversation. Mom, you never told us any of this, he said. I looked at him and smiled gently. Because I never thought it mattered. The truth was simple. I had never worn the dress because of its potential value. I wore it because it reminded me of a life that had shaped me. A life that existed long before social media, luxury brands, and appearances became measures of success. Sophie reached for my hand. Grandma, it is beautiful, she said softly. Her words meant more to me than anything Margaret had revealed. Across the room, guests began sharing theories and questions. Some wondered how old the dress was. Others asked about the designer. One woman admitted she had mistaken it for an ordinary vintage piece when she first saw it. Margaret answered patiently, explaining details about the fabric and construction that most people would never notice. As I listened, memories surfaced one after another. I remembered opening the box nearly 5 decades earlier. I remembered my husband smiling as he handed it to me. I remembered dancing with him at a charity gala in Boston, while a small orchestra played standards from another era. The dress had witnessed some of the happiest moments of my life. That was its true value to me. Money had never entered the equation. Yet the reactions around me revealed something uncomfortable. Many of the people who now admired the dress had ignored it when they believed it was worthless. Their opinions had changed the moment they thought it might carry prestige. Vanessa seemed to recognize the same thing. The confidence she usually carried so effortlessly was beginning to crack. She checked her phone repeatedly. She laughed at comments that were not funny. She interrupted Margaret twice, only to receive polite but dismissive responses. For the first time since arriving, she was no longer controlling the narrative. Then an older gentleman approached Margaret and greeted her warmly. After a brief exchange, he looked directly at me. If this is the piece I believe it is, he said, you may be wearing one of the most sought-after examples from that collection. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd again. I looked down at the sleeve resting against my wrist. All evening people had seen an old dress. Suddenly, they were beginning to see something else entirely. And I had a feeling the biggest surprise had not yet been revealed. The gentleman introduced himself as Charles Whitmore, and judging by the reaction around him, many people already knew who he was. He carried himself with the ease of someone respected in his field. After exchanging a few words with Margaret, he turned his attention back to me. "May I take a closer look?" he asked. I nodded. Charles carefully examined the stitching near the cuffs and the lining hidden beneath the sleeve. His expression grew more serious with each passing second. Around us, the conversations in the ballroom had softened into a steady hum of curiosity. Even the guests standing across the room seemed to be watching. Charles finally stepped back and smiled. "Margaret was right," he said. "In fact, she may have been understating it." Vanessa shifted her weight. "I had no idea we were looking at some kind of treasure," she said with a nervous laugh. Charles glanced toward her. Very few people would. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Carter, pieces from this collection rarely appear in public. Most are locked away in private archives or museum storage. The condition of this one is exceptional." I could feel dozens of eyes moving from him to me and back again. Earlier that evening, people had been discussing table arrangements, catering, and wedding plans. Now they were discussing a dress hanging quietly in my closet for decades. Sophie squeezed my hand. "Grandma, this is incredible." I smiled at her. "It is still the same dress it was this morning." That answer made Margaret laugh softly. "And that is exactly why it matters," she said. Charles nodded in agreement. The market changes. Trends change. Value changes. But authenticity remains rare. Several guests stepped closer. Questions came from every direction. Where had it been purchased? How old was it? Had it ever been restored? I answered what I could. The truth was simple. After my husband gave it to me, I cared for it carefully. I stored it properly. I wore it only on special occasions. I never imagined anyone outside my family would find it noteworthy. Ryan looked at me with an expression I had not seen in years. Respect. Genuine respect. "Mom," he said quietly, "I cannot believe you never mentioned any of this." I looked at him for a moment. "You never asked." His eyes dropped toward the floor. Across the room, Vanessa stood unusually silent. Earlier, she had been the center of attention. Now attention had moved elsewhere, and she seemed unsure how to reclaim it. A few guests who had laughed at her jokes avoided looking directly at her. Others suddenly appeared fascinated by the floral arrangements or their phones. It was remarkable how quickly confidence disappeared when the crowd changed direction. Then Charles folded his arms and studied the dress one final time. "If this piece were ever presented at the right auction," he said, "the final number would surprise many people in this room." A ripple of astonishment moved through the crowd. I saw Vanessa's eyes widen despite her effort to hide it. But strangely, the number itself no longer interested me. Watching the room transform was far more revealing. Because the dress had not changed. The people around it had. As the excitement continued to spread through the ballroom, I noticed something I had not expected. People were no longer asking questions about the garment itself. They were asking about the stories connected to it. A woman near the dessert table wanted to know where I had worn it. Another guest asked how long I had owned it. Someone else wondered whether my husband had chosen it himself. Those questions felt different. They were not about value. They were about life. For the first time that evening, I felt completely at ease. I told them about a charity gala in Boston many years ago. I described a train trip my husband and I had taken along the East Coast during our younger days. I shared memories of anniversaries, holiday dinners, and family photographs. As I spoke, the room seemed to relax around me. The attention was no longer focused on a rare collectible. It was focused on experiences that many people recognize from their own lives. Sophie stayed beside me the entire time. Every now and then she smiled at something I said. Seeing her there reminded me why I had come in the first place. This was her special evening. Nothing else truly mattered. Across the room, I caught sight of Vanessa speaking quietly with two of her friends. Their expressions were strained. Earlier they had laughed easily. Now their smiles appeared uncertain. It was not difficult to understand why. The comments that had seemed harmless an hour ago suddenly looked different in the light of new information. Ryan eventually walked over carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me. "Mom," he said, I owe you an apology. I looked at him but said nothing. He took a breath. I should have said something earlier. His voice was quiet enough that only I could hear it. When Vanessa made those remarks, I should have stepped in. I studied his face for a moment. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not because of the attention surrounding the dress, but because he had finally recognized his own silence. Thank you, I said. That means more than you realize. He nodded slowly. Sometimes growth begins with a simple acknowledgement. A few minutes later, Margaret and Charles joined us again. They had been discussing historical collections with several guests, but Charles appeared eager to continue the conversation. There is one detail I have not mentioned yet, he said. Instantly, several people nearby turned toward him. Margaret smiled knowingly. I was wondering when you would bring that up. Charles looked directly at me. The last comparable piece that appeared at a private event attracted interest from multiple collectors across the country. A hush settled over the small group. Even Vanessa looked up from across the room. Charles folded his hands calmly. The final offer exceeded what many people would spend on a house. The reaction was immediate. Eyes widened. Conversations stopped. And in that moment I realized the evening had reached a point where nobody was laughing anymore. The number itself was never spoken aloud, yet it hardly mattered. The reaction in the room said everything. Guests exchanged glances. A few quietly repeated Charles's words to people standing farther away. Others stared at me as though I had suddenly become someone different. It was a strange feeling because I was exactly the same person who had walked through those doors earlier that evening. The same woman. The same memories. The same dress. Only their perception had changed. Charles seemed to notice my discomfort. Please do not misunderstand, he said kindly. The monetary value is impressive, but that is not why collectors admire pieces like this. They admire what survives. Most things disappear. Very few endure. I nodded. That explanation made far more sense to me than any discussion about auctions or collectors. Endurance. I understood that word. I had endured the loss of my husband. I had endured years of learning how to live alone. I had endured countless moments when people assumed that age made a person less relevant. Endurance was something I understood very well. Sophie smiled and slipped her arm through mine. Grandma, I think you are the most interesting person at this party. I laughed softly. That was not part of the plan. Maybe it should have been, she replied. Her words warmed me more than any compliment from the crowd ever could. Nearby, several guests continued speaking with Margaret and Charles. One woman admitted she had nearly donated a similar garment years ago, without realizing its significance. Another shared a story about a watch, passed down through 3 generations. Slowly, the conversation shifted from money to family history, from possessions to memories, from objects to the people connected to them. Felt healthier somehow, more honest. Ryan remained close by. Every now and then he glanced toward Vanessa. She was standing with a small group near the windows, but she seemed increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people. Earlier she had controlled every conversation she entered. Now she appeared unsure of what to say. The confidence that once filled the room around her had quietly evaporated. Then something unexpected happened. An older woman approached me carrying a phone. Mrs. Carter, she said, I owe you an apology. I looked at her in surprise. For what? She smiled awkwardly. I laughed earlier when someone made a joke about your outfit. I should not have. Her honesty caught me off guard. Before I could respond, another guest nodded in agreement. Then another. One by one, people began admitting things they normally would have ignored. Small things. Careless things. Yet hearing them acknowledge those moments felt important. Not because I needed their apologies but because self-awareness is rare. Across the ballroom, Vanessa watched the exchange unfold. For the first time all evening, there was no laughter in her eyes. Only realization. And as I looked at her from across the room, I began to suspect that the lesson unfolding tonight had very little to do with fashion and everything to do with how we choose to measure another person's worth. The evening continued, but the energy inside the ballroom had changed completely. Earlier, people had been focused on appearances. Now they were paying attention to character. I could feel the difference in every conversation. Guests approached me not because of what I was wearing but because they wanted to talk. They wanted to share stories about parents, grandparents, and family heirlooms that had survived decades of change. The atmosphere felt warmer, more genuine. Sophie remained at my side, introducing me to friends I had never met before. Several of them were surprised to learn that I had traveled extensively with my late husband, volunteered in local charities for years, and helped support community projects long before most of them were born. It was amusing in a way. For years I had been the same person. Yet many people were only beginning to see me now. Near the center of the ballroom, Ryan finally approached Vanessa. They spoke quietly, but their expressions revealed enough. Vanessa nodded several times. Ryan listened without interrupting. Whatever was being said between them appeared serious. Neither seemed angry. Instead, they looked uncomfortable in the way people often do when they are forced to confront something they would rather avoid. Margaret eventually joined me again. "You are handling this remarkably well," she said. I smiled. "Handling what?" She laughed softly. "Most people would be tempted to enjoy this reversal a little too much." I understood what she meant. Earlier in the evening, I had been the target of jokes. Now the situation had turned completely around. Yet I felt no desire to embarrass anyone. Age teaches many lessons. One of them is that humiliation rarely improves a person. Understanding does. Across the room, Charles was speaking with several guests who seemed fascinated by the history of preservation and collecting. The discussion had become one of the most popular conversations at the event. Ironically, it had nothing to do with wealth anymore. It had become a conversation about respect for the past, respect for craftsmanship, respect for people who came before us. Then I noticed something unexpected. Vanessa was walking toward me. The room did not fall silent, but several nearby guests became noticeably attentive. Sophie looked between us. Ryan followed a few steps behind. Vanessa stopped in front of me and for a moment seemed unsure how to begin. The confident smile she usually wore was gone. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "there is something I need to say." Her voice was different now. Not theatrical. Not performative. Just honest. I waited patiently. She glanced down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "I judged you tonight," she said. "And I judged you long before tonight." The words hung in the air between us. Nobody interrupted. Nobody looked away. For the first time since the party began, Vanessa was not trying to control the room. She was simply telling the truth. And somehow, that moment carried more weight than anything Charles or Margaret had revealed all evening. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The ballroom seemed quieter than before, not because the music had stopped or the conversations had ended, but because people sensed that something important was happening. Vanessa took a slow breath. "I spent years assuming I understood who you were," she said. "I thought I knew what mattered to you. I thought I knew what kind of life you had lived." Her voice remained steady, but I could hear the regret underneath it. And I was wrong. I listened without interrupting. Around us, guests pretended not to watch while clearly paying attention. Ryan stood beside her now, his expression thoughtful. Sophie remained close to me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Vanessa glanced around the room before looking back at me. "Tonight I realized something embarrassing," she continued. "I spent more time paying attention to appearances than to people." No one reacted outwardly, but several faces nearby softened. It was a difficult thing to admit publicly. "I judged your clothes, your habits, the way you choose to live. I assumed those things told me everything I needed to know." She paused. "They did not." I smiled gently. "Most people make mistakes." Vanessa nodded. "Yes, but not everyone takes responsibility for them." The honesty in her answer surprised me. Earlier that evening, I would not have expected those words from her. Margaret and Charles exchanged a glance but remained silent. They seemed to understand that this conversation no longer belonged to them. The dress, the history, the attention from collectors, all of it had become secondary. The real story had shifted elsewhere. Ryan finally spoke. "Mom always told me that character reveals itself over time." He looked at Vanessa. Then he looked at me. I think I forgot that. I could see genuine reflection in his face. Not guilt alone, but understanding. Sometimes people become so busy building their future that they stop appreciating the people who helped create it. Sophie smiled faintly. Grandma has been teaching all of us things tonight. The comment earned a few quiet laughs. Even I laughed. The tension that had filled the room earlier was slowly disappearing. In its place was something far more valuable. Perspective. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly before speaking again. I am sorry, Evelyn. There was no audience in her voice this time. No performance. No attempt to protect her image. Just a simple apology. I studied her for a moment. I thought about the comments from earlier. The laughter. The assumptions. Then I thought about my husband, the memories connected to the dress, and the years that had taught me what truly matters. Holding on to resentment suddenly felt unnecessary. Thank you, I said. That takes courage. Relief crossed her face. Not because she had escaped embarrassment, but because she had finally spoken honestly. Around us, conversations slowly resumed. The party began to feel like a celebration again. Yet as people returned to their tables and their drinks, I noticed something important. Nobody was talking about value anymore. Nobody was discussing collectors or auctions. They were talking about respect. And that told me the evening had accomplished something far more meaningful than any appraisal ever could. As the evening slowly moved toward its conclusion, the ballroom felt lighter than it had when I first arrived. The music seemed warmer. The laughter sounded more genuine. Guests returned to celebrating Sophie and the future that lay ahead of her. That was exactly how it should have been from the beginning. I found myself standing near the large windows once more, looking out at the evening sky. The last traces of sunset had faded, leaving a peaceful blanket of stars above the grounds. Sophie joined me and slipped her arm through mine. This turned into a memorable engagement party, she said with a smile. I laughed softly. I think memorable is one way to describe it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me and said something I will never forget. Grandma, tonight reminded me that people are so much more than what everyone sees on the surface. I looked at her and smiled. That lesson will serve you well throughout your life. Across the room, Ryan and Vanessa were speaking with guests together. There was a different energy between them now. More thoughtful. Less concerned with appearances. Vanessa caught my eye from across the ballroom and offered a small smile. I returned it. Not because the evening had somehow erased every mistake, but because people deserve the opportunity to grow. Margaret and Charles eventually stopped by to say goodbye. Both thanked me for sharing the story behind the garment. I thanked them for helping others see beyond it. As they left, Margaret paused and gently touched my arm. The most valuable thing in this room was never the piece you were wearing, she said. It was the grace with which you carried yourself. Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Later, as guests began gathering their coats and saying their farewells, several people approached me one final time. Some shared family stories. Others spoke about parents or grandparents they suddenly wanted to call. One woman told me she planned to ask her mother about old family photographs she had never taken the time to appreciate. Those conversations meant far more to me than any discussion of rarity or value. Eventually it was time to leave. I hugged Sophie tightly and wished her happiness. I hugged Ryan as well. When Vanessa stepped forward, there was a brief moment of hesitation before she embraced me. Thank you, she whispered. For what? I asked. She smiled. For reminding me what matters. I squeezed her hand gently. Then I walked toward the exit. As I passed through the ballroom doors, I glanced once more at the room behind me. Earlier that evening, people had looked at an older woman in an old garment and assumed they knew her story. By the end of the night, they had learned something far more important. Some things carry value because they are rare. Some things carry value because they are expensive. But the things that matter most carry value because they survive, because they endure, and because they remind us that every person has a story worth respecting long before anyone discovers what it is worth. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.